Count Corla, at 1 p.m. today, just as the Minister for Finance rose to begin the delivery of his budget speech, an email was sent by a head manager in the Media House group to all staff indicating that the Fingal Independent would cease trading from the end of October, which is a devastating blow for local media in North County Dublin. And unfortunately, the 0% VAT rate for newspaper media announced in the budget has come too late for this particular publication. And it made me think of what other eye-catching, well-intentioned and indeed costed proposals in this budget will also come too little and too late for those who need it. And considering what we've all been through over the last number of years and the crises that we've faced in health, the permanent cost of living crisis and the never-ending housing emergency, people are in desperate need of some hope. But the overwhelming feeling that I get and my colleagues in the Labour Party get is one of helplessness and despondency. There's a feeling that not one single or indeed combined measure announced in this government, while some may help people tread water for a very short period of time, but that ultimately they're not going to change the system, they're not going to provide a fundamental change in people's lives so that they live a more secure and a safer and a better life. That they're going to get a grip on this spiralling cost of living crisis, and that they're going to prevent people from being evicted from their homes, because that is where the hardest edge of this housing crisis is right now. And none of the housing measures today actually spoke to that. They spoke to where the hardest edge was maybe a year or two ago. And it's another example of why this government is just out of touch with where the real crises of this country are and what's needed to solve them. We will be back at square one come late winter or early spring. And politics is always about choices. And this budget is like a game of chess. Every single move matters. But what it seems this government has done is, with these eye-catching measures, they pushed all their pawns into the centre of the board, hoping to dazzle people into thinking that they're a powerful force that's going to resolve all their crises, but they've not moved their more important pieces, which means they're not going to win the game, they're not going to create the change that's needed, and ultimately they're going to cheat the public, the Irish public, out of the solutions that are required to solve the many crises they are facing. By trying to please everybody today, they will actually please nobody. And this cynical attempt to buy more time in office by taking people's money and giving it back to them will ultimately end in tears. Right now, Ireland simply is just not working. For far too many people, this budget will not change that fact. And on the face of it, there does seem to be something for everybody in the audience, similar to the Fianna Fáil budgets of the Celtic Tiger area. But drill down into the detail, and there is little systemic change, again, like the Fianna Fáil budget from the Celtic Tiger era. People are being bought with their own money, with tokenistic tax cuts, and we'll be paying an unexpected bill when it arrives, or when families need additional childcare, and the knock-on from these massive interest rate hikes. It's going to be in one hand and straight out the other. On transport, the extension of the 20% reduction of the transport costs and the expansion of the short hop zone into commuter counties outside Dublin is a good thing. But in the round, these measures seem largely piecemeal. If we want to be serious about getting people out of their cars and using sustainable, affordable forms of transport, we need more radical action. It should also be considered that transport costs are essentially costs that have been reintroduced for the majority of public transport users. During the pandemic, those who were working remotely would have in fact saved on transport costs. But now, because we don't have a real right to flexible work in this country, people are having an additional cost now refoisted upon them in a time where costs for transport are rising across the board. We in the Labour Party called for a €9 climate ticket to be made available nationwide on a trial basis in an effort to encourage people onto public transport and reduce our emissions. The trial of such a scheme was very successful in Germany and saw a massive uptake. It was ambitious, it made public transport a more viable option for people and saw significant positives in reducing carbon emissions. And for people like those I represent in North County Dublin, it would make a massive difference. Of course, beyond encouraging people to use public transport, we also need significant more investment in modes of active travel. Working parents should not have to rely on cars to get their kids to school. It is senseless that the government haven't introduced an expansion of the Cycle to Work scheme to allow parents to purchase a bike for their children under such a scheme. The recent school transport scheme fiasco and the government's handling of it only drives this point home further. We also need to get innovative in our approach to transport in Ireland. France plans to introduce a car scrappage scheme that will provide grants for trading an old car in exchange for an e-bike or a cargo bike. What's stopping this government from introducing a similar scheme here? Again, it's a simple measure that's being done elsewhere that will encourage people to get out of their cars, reduce their costs and give us a better chance of meeting our climate targets. We should also be looking at improving our existing cycling infrastructure. There are many towns across the country with ghost cycle lanes that simply aren't being used because they're not connected to transport nodes. Why isn't this government developing the city bike scheme and piloting town bike schemes across the country? Again, it's another scheme that is stalled. I welcome that there have been commitments to projects such as Metrolink and Bus Connects, but again, these are copy and paste commitments that have appeared in previous budget statements. We must show that these big projects, that there's real commitment to delivering them and they're linked with substantial active travel projects, including cycle paths and better pathways for pedestrians. We need to join up the dots on the future-proofing of our public infrastructure. That is how the conversation should proceed. Metrolink, for example, does not exist in isolation from improved cycling infrastructure and other measures such as Bus Connects. We're told that the government will reduce childcare costs by 25% or €1,200 a year. But tell that to a family in Dublin where the monthly bill is over €1,000 for one child. The changes in this budget are in reality only a fall of 10%. Last weekend, we saw budget kites being flown with a report that the Minister for Health will announce free GP care extended to 400,000 children. But nobody believes this. This is building on 5 years of broken promises from Fine Gael on this matter. There has been just an absolute stalling of any extension of this GP care scheme. And what we're hearing now is that GPs haven't even been included in the conversation based on last year's announcement. So there's no faith that there'll be any real extension in a free GP scheme for children. Parents of 6- and 7-year-olds want to know what happened to the government announcement last year. Those children are now 7, 8 or even 9 years old, have aged out of your broken promise from last year. The Minister's budget statement on the 14th of October 2021 said, funding of €45 million is provided in 2022 for a range of measures to advance the objective of sláinte care and specifically to ensure that care is accessible and affordable for the most vulnerable in our society. These measures included the expansion of free GP care to children aged 6 and 7. This simply hasn't happened. In January 2020, the then Minister for Health, Simon Harris, announced that he had received government approval to extend free GP care to all children under 13. That still hasn't happened. Again, the only party to have delivered free GP care in any way has been the Labour Party, and it's far too long that this scheme hasn't been extended and improved. But primary care is much more than just GPs, and primary care centres should provide a full suite of community-centred healthcare. We need investment in community diagnostics and assessment hubs and work towards treating more chronic diseases in the community. Resourcing supports for those with dementia, diabetes, asthma and a range of other conditions will reduce pressure on acute hospitals. I note that €443 million has been allocated to tackle waiting lists, an increase of €225 million based on last year. But is this costed and planned against the delivering of staff that will be needed to tackle these waiting lists? Because throwing money and lines in budget speeches at this will not solve the waiting list crisis. We know there's no workforce planning. We know that there's no plan to deliver more nurses, deliver more healthcare assistants, more physios, and more healthcare professionals that are actually going to be able to tackle and beat our waiting list crisis. It must be noted that the Department of Health has still not paid the pandemic recognition payment to one single Section 39 worker, contract cleaner, caterer, member of security staff, workers in private nursing homes, or public health workers not employed with the HSE, or workers like Dublin Fire Brigade, paramedics. Bluntly, it's beyond insulting at this stage.
Hear, hear.
The HSE has made it clear to unions from day one that the circular that gives effect to the decision to pay non-HSE staff lies fairly with the Department of Health and the Minister. So, in essence, it lies fairly with your government, and you're not doing it. You're not delivering this payment, which was a bonus payment of recognition, which has now become a literal, must-needed cost of living payment for these workers. The longer you shirk your responsibility, the longer these workers will be left high and dry during the worst cost of living crisis of our time. In our alternative budget, Labour this year again have focused on meeting the massive unmet demand for disability services which the Disability Capacity Review found required an all-in investment of €350 million in 2022. And for this year would again commit €270 million in funding. These are vital commitments to vital services in residential care, day services and personal assistant hours and respite care. We acknowledge that some effort has been made in this budget towards that, but we need to see the detail again of how it will be delivered. Again, we have no faith that there is an actual plan to staff the positions that are needed to deliver on this. Life and work in Ireland is becoming increasingly difficult for too many. I've seen in my clinics over the last 3 years a huge increase of people in my community reaching out, asking for help. It is all too frequently someone who served an eviction notice by their landlord or someone who's unable to afford basic bills and household expenses. I've heard many young people whose options are narrowing now towards emigration. Well, you announced today €215 million for homeless services, an increase of €21 million, and you announced it as if it was an achievement. This belies, makes a lie out of any claim that Housing for All has been a success. When you're year on year increasing the provision for homeless service, you are in essence acknowledging the emergency and disaster of your own policies. We need to ensure that this country is a great place to grow up, to get qualifications, to join the workforce, not to be forever broke, not to be straight into debt and see no hope of ever either owning your home or securing a long-term, stable, affordable rental home. What really matters for people is securing these homes, investing in quality public health care and taking real measures to tackle the cost of living. We have lived a summer of discontent. The reality is that hard-working people are facing into a cruel winter with rising childcare and high food costs and energy costs. The cost of living crisis, as we know, is no joke. It's no game for people. It is their lives. They've been living it now for well over a year. This is not the first cost of living budget that has been required. On climate, it's time for the government to get serious about climate, as my colleague, Deputy Jed Nash, has said. It is, along with housing, one of the biggest failures of this government, which are now closer, may we say, to the next general election than they were to the last. So we're at a time where we need to be seeing deliverables, where we need to be seeing results. In our budget, the Labour Party called for climate action to be one of the issues to inform all other policies. That's because we in Labour recognise that radical action is needed to address this issue, and we're committed to addressing all the threats that it poses. But as I said, politics is about choices, and it's clear that this government has made theirs. The giddiness that I have seen in the corridors outside this chamber today about this budget is not reflected in the households and businesses up and down this country. The politics, there's a lot of claims of who actually owns this budget. Is it Fine Gael? Is it Fianna Fáil? I'm seeing a lot of Fianna Fáil in this. I've seen the plaster politics of Fianna Fáil being brought back. And whilst Fianna Fáil argue internally over whether to allow Bertie back to join their ranks, it's pretty clear that Bertie economics is not only back, but it is front and central of this government's budgetary policy. They're throwing money at the problem in the hope that it goes away, and it won't. We've learned that from the past. The problems we have in this country are systemic, and this budget lacks the ambition to drive real change and meaningful change. Most of the measures are either reheated, half-baked, or they're just not going to be enough to help people. The wealth divide in this country is growing. We have a multi-track economy, and this is breaking up the social contract. It is why so many people are angry. It's why so many people are despondent. Parents are afraid of losing their children to emigration, or indeed, if they stay here, just losing them to a lost generation of someone who's not able to fulfil their potential, to be able to live their lives in security and be able to achieve what they deserve to achieve. People see reports about Ireland's booming economy and bulging surpluses, but feel completely disconnected from it. They feel left behind, disenfranchised and marginalised. That is my experience of what I'm seeing in my constituency and what my Labour colleagues are seeing. The gap between the have-lots, the have-somes and the have-nots has been copper-fastened by this budget. We need to close the gap. The reality is that those on the side of the better off got more than they expected from this budget, and those of us that are on the side of the many who got less than we need to survive and thrive, again, have been left behind. Thank you.
Well done.